ask yourself, what is the biggest fear that is holding you back from taking the action you want? What is the pain that you're avoiding? Is this a primal fear or is this an intellectual fear? Hello, welcome back to the Work Life Mindset Podcast. This is Chris, and I'm super excited to have you join me for today's conversation on fear. And I want to dive specifically into a couple types of fear. And before I do that, I just want to introduce this concept that really kind of blew my mind when I heard it, is that as humans, we are only born with two fears, okay? Two fears that you will find in all newborns and infants. Everything else is a learned fear. And why this is fascinating is that if it's a learned fear, we can unlearn it. Okay. Much like my talk with everybody here about beliefs, they're learned beliefs. And if they're learned, we can unlearn them. And, these aren't the two fears I aim to talk about, but the two fears, not to leave you hanging, that we're all born with is falling and loud noises. Okay. They've done all kinds of pretty crazy, unethical studies on babies in the 50s and early 60s that have shown that, when we come out and we're born, it's really just loud noises and falling. Everything else is a learned fear. And it's interesting when we can kind of make space and question, where did our fears come from? Right? I think that's the start of the journey to addressing these fears, challenging these fears, same with your beliefs, and learning how to overcome them and push past them and bring some rational thought into this. Because again, a lot of these fears were formed when we were young and we didn't have a lot of logic. Now we're adults. So let's kind of take another look at this stuff. I think there are the five of the most common fears that I have found are the fear of failure, the fear of rejection, the fear of success, the fear of abandonment, which also looks like judgment, fear of judgment, and this concept I run into a lot called the imposter syndrome, right? These are very common fears, and they can all kind of be tied to this belief of self-worth that like I am not enough, right? Um, we can be worried that we're gonna fail our children, and it's like, well, I'm not a good enough parent, right? We can maybe have a fear about like being too busy, right? And oh yeah, I'm not strong enough or organized enough to, deal with all that, it's just not going to happen. Right. So these fears, interesting, especially the most common ones, the rejection, the failure, the abandonment or judgment, success, and imposter syndrome are all not rational, if we can believe that. So the two types of fears that I want to introduce is this concept of a primal fear versus an intellectual fear, right? Primal fear has really like physical pain or death attached to it. Okay. This is like, I'm not going to go run across the highway. I might get run over. I'm not going to, step off that building, that bridge, like it's going to hurt down there, right? Not going to go in the cage with the tiger. Something really bad might happen. Now, conversely, we have intellectual fears, which we kind of create. We kind of make them up when we're safe. Because we really, yeah, oddly, it's just we have nothing else to do. Okay. So the intellectual fears is more tied to like, yeah, look at judgment. What is so and so going to think about what I'm wearing today? Well, I'm afraid of that. So I'm going to tone it down. I'm going to wear something else, or maybe just avoid that person. Um, you know, Fear is really interesting in the way that our amygdala, the fear center of our brain, can't tell the difference between these two things, a primal fear or an intellectual fear. And millions of years ago, there was a literal tiger in the bush. Okay. We lived in caves. because caves were safe. It was protected on three sides. Our brain's main function was to keep us safe. And, stepping out opened us up to all these fears. And they were really primal fears back then. And so our brain has evolved for thousands of generations, some might say millions of years, to address these primal fears to keep us safe. Every fear was tied to our safety and our survival. And that was the brain's main function. Okay. That's why even today, when there are no primal fears, the brain's going to make up some intellectual fears because it needs to feel like it's doing something. It interests me. It's fascinating and also kind of a bummer that our brain has not changed that much in the last million years. Um, but our environment has changed incredibly. In fact, when you look at the span of time, you know, okay, some would argue our brains have changed a lot, but how much of our brains changed in, say, the last 300 or 400 years versus how much our environment tied to our safety has changed? And primal fears are not something we need to worry about every day. But if the brain's not always focused or thinking of a fear, it thinks it's not doing its job, which is keeping you alive. And even today, people have put what I think is a good definition of fear as like an anxious feeling that's caused by our anticipation of some imagined event or experience. Okay. An anxious feeling caused by our anticipation of some imagined event or experience. And this is crazy because our fears aren't really real. These intellectual fears aren't real. Like they're in the future. They're monsters we make up in the future, but we're fearing them now. And when I kind of made space to connect with this, it really allowed me and others I get to work with to kind of, you know, let go of a little bit of that and realize that this is just the brain doing what it's meant to do. No judgment, no guilt. That's just, how it is. But realizing that I don't need to fear that right now because these fears, these five most common fears, these intellectual fears that are not rational, um, they're not functional. They're also like not existing in this present moment. It's some future event that we're afraid of versus, the primal fears are rational. They are functional. Like, yeah, I don't want to go run out on that busy highway and cross it because I'm going to get hurt, it could die. So again, this is just the brain doing what it's meant to do. It's a survival mechanism. It wants to anticipate, what's going to happen to keep us alive. That fear center of the brain is always going to keep doing this. But we can kind of make a conscious decision to understand, is this a primal fear or is this an intellectual fear? And kind of hack that to understand, whether or not we're going to listen to that fear, right? How do you overcome these fears? Well, the interesting part is you kind of can't overcome them because they're not real. The intellectual fears of failure, of rejection, of success and judgment, they're not real because it's a future event that you're afraid of. It hasn't even happened yet. You can't really pin on there. But because the brain always wants to be dealing with fears, you can actually adopt a new fear. And you can adopt a fear that maybe is different and greater than some of these, right? And what you focus on is generally what's going to manifest, right? So if you're focusing on this really bad negativity, that's generally what's going to happen. If you keep worrying about this one thing happening, there's a good chance it's just going to happen because you're in so much worry, you're not really taking action. Um, so at any moment though, you can kind of realize that like you are the director of your script. So you can take back that attention and that energy and direct it maybe to something better, maybe to something more positive. But you could also use the fact that your brain wants to be solving problems and making up all these fears in the future to look at a stronger fear in the future that maybe will help motivate to get you what you want. And for that, I think you want to explore what the pain is. So, like, what pain are you trying to avoid in the future? Okay, you're trying to do something, you're trying to build a business, you're trying to get better health, you're trying to get successful so you don't have to stress about money. Um, like, why? Go deep into the why are you trying to do that? Like, what's going to happen if you don't? And what pain are you trying to avoid there? For me, it's I want to provide my children with every opportunity that they can have. I want to, reach thousands, if not millions of people to build more compassion and kindness in the world and help people get unstuck. Because I believe this next generation in particular really needs to be high performing. They need to live with intention, on passion, and on purpose to fix the planetary issues, to fix society's issues that we're not really doing too much. We're moving the needle. I don't want to sound like nothing's happening, but I think more needs to happen. So I have a stronger fear rather than fearing the failure or people judging what I'm doing. I have a stronger fear of growing to an old age and, the world not changing and my son's having to deal with that and deal with that implications. And so I use that as a pain that I'm trying to avoid to do this. So again, I think just bringing a little bit of awareness into the fact that there's a primal fear and there's an intellectual fear. The primal fears are very rational, but the intellectual fears are not irrational. The primal fears, like right now, I mean, you get it. I'm not saying they don't exist. Like, you're standing on a cliff, you're doing something, and you're just like, ooh, this could be really, really dangerous. That's now, that's in the present. But all these other fears, like, oh, I might fail, I might be judged, I might be rejected, right? Who am I to do XYZ or whatever? I mean, those are all based on, you know, some kind of anticipated or imagined event or outcome that hasn't happened yet. So it's really not real. So I think it's good to ask yourself, right? What is the biggest fear that is holding you back from taking the action you want? And you can ask yourself, maybe, where did you learn it? Right? Was it from other people, or maybe you saw other people with that fear? A sibling or a parent was really afraid of that thing, or maybe you saw that kind of failure to other people that you love. And then you can kind of make space to, explore that with curiosity and see how is that holding you back, right? And to hack that, to adopt a new fear, look at what is the pain that you're avoiding, by having that fear, and see if you can't adopt a new, maybe even stronger fear that will hopefully drive you to overcome this kind of petty, what does Susie in accounting think of what I'm wearing? Who cares what people think? The judgment doesn't matter. What matters is the life we live and the actions we take. And, is any of that going to matter when you're on your deathbed and questioning, did you live to your highest potential and to the greatest version of yourself? So, primal fears, intellectual fears. We're going to do a few more episodes on fear in general and specifically dive into these 5 most common fears. But for now, it's just understanding the difference of a primal fear that has physical pain and death attached, and an intellectual fear, which is something we're creating when we're safe. We're creating it in our head. It's some perceived future event that hasn't really even happened, but the brain's going to go there because it has nothing else to do. There are no primal fears. And it does think that if it's not constantly keeping us safe from primal fears, we're going to die, which is true, but it can't tell the difference between a primal fear and an intellectual fear. So that's what I have for you today. Please check us out on Instagram at Work Life Mindset, also the Facebook group Work Life Mindset, and the website worklifemindset.com. All kinds of great free resources and toolboxes in there for personal growth and development. Have a wonderful day. Thank you all so much.